Imagine getting caught stealing a loaf of bread, and the punishment isn't jail time. It's being sewn inside a sack with a wild animal and thrown into a river. Sounds fake, right? But welcome to ancient Rome, where some crimes got you tossed in with a monkey, a rooster, a dog, and a snake all at once. That punishment was called poena culi, and it was reserved for people who committed one of the worst crimes you could commit back then: killing your own parents. It wasn't just about death. It was about humiliation, fear, and making sure your last moments were pure chaos. Now, you'd think that was as weird as ancient justice got, but no, not even close. In ancient Persia, they had something even worse. It was called scaphism, and it's so horrifying most people think it's just an internet myth. The victim would be forced into two small boats, one for the back, one for the front, trapping the body like a human sandwich. Then they were force-fed milk and honey until they had diarrhea. Sounds strange already, right? But wait, they didn't stop there. The person would be left in a swamp or under the sun, and the insects, they'd go wild. The milk and honey would rot. Flies, beetles, maggots, they'd crawl into every part of the body. The person didn't die in a day or two, but over weeks, slowly eaten alive from the inside and out. And what about ancient China? Well, there they had a punishment called death by 1,000 cuts, literally what it sounds like. It wasn't just about execution. It was meant to destroy your soul, your reputation, your afterlife. Each cut was deliberate, and the pain was stretched out for as long as possible. It was banned in the early 1900s, but before that, it was used for crimes against the state, betrayal, or just ticking off the wrong official. And yeah, it wasn't quick. But here's the thing. As brutal as these punishments were, they were all about sending a message. Public, painful, unforgettable. They wanted you to feel it, see it, and remember it. Fear was the point, not fairness. Okay, so let's talk about the Vikings. You've probably heard of them as fierce warriors, but their punishments, straight-up nightmare fuel. Ever heard of the blood eagle? This wasn't your average execution. If someone betrayed a Viking chieftain, especially family betrayal, they wouldn't just get their head chopped off. No. The blood eagle was like something out of a horror movie. First, the ribs were cut from the spine. Then they were spread open like wings. The lungs pulled out through the back, still attached, all while the victim was supposedly alive. Some historians debate whether it really happened, but Viking sagas mention it again and again. Either way, it was designed to be brutal, unforgettable, and terrifying. Now shift to ancient India. They had a punishment for thieves and cheaters that was humiliating in every way. Picture this. You're paraded through town on a donkey, backwards, while people throw garbage at you. And if that wasn't enough, your nose might get chopped off. Public shame was the point. They wanted everyone to see you and remember you. Ancient Mesopotamia had their own weird twist on justice too. Under the Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's oldest legal systems, if a builder made a house that collapsed and killed the owner's son, guess what? The builder's son would be killed in return. It wasn't about fixing the mistake. It was an eye for an eye, even if someone else had to pay. And in medieval England, they didn't play around with lies. People accused of theft or treason could face trial by ordeal. You'd have to walk across red-hot plowshares or plunge your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Then they'd bandage your wounds and wait 3 days. If they were healing, you were innocent. If not, guilty. Either way, you were probably scarred for life. Either way. Now imagine this. You've been accused of stealing bread in ancient Persia. You swear you didn't do it. Maybe someone planted the evidence. Doesn't matter. The punishment? They gouge out your eyes. But not immediately. First, you're dragged into the public square, tied to a post, and forced to confess under the beating sun. Then they take red-hot irons and burn them into your sockets. Not for justice, but for fear. So the next person who thinks about stealing remembers your screams. This wasn't just about law, it was about control. Now travel to ancient China. Some crimes were punishable by a method called death by 1,000 cuts. It was exactly what it sounds like. The victim would be tied up, and the executioner would slice them slowly, piece by piece, and over hours. Cheeks, arms, chest, thighs, dozens, then hundreds of cuts. This wasn't just about death. It was about turning your final moments into a performance. A slow, public unraveling of your body while people watched. Some were given opium first to dull the pain, but others weren't so lucky. And what about ancient Rome? Ever heard of poena culli? It was a punishment for patricide, killing your own father. If found guilty, you'd be sewn into a leather sack alive, along with a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. Then the sack would be thrown into the river. You and those animals trapped, drowning together, biting, scratching, panicking. It sounds made up, like some twisted myth. But the Romans actually recorded it. They believed killing your father was so unnatural, your punishment had to be unnatural too. It wasn't about justice, it was about horror. These weren't just ancient laws, they were theater, messages, psychological warfare. Don't steal, don't lie, don't betray, or we'll make your ending worse than death. Okay, let's go deeper. This next one sounds like it came from a horror movie. Imagine being tied down to a wooden table. You're breathing fast, begging. A soldier walks over holding a metal bucket. Inside, a hungry rat. They flip the bucket upside down onto your bare stomach, then begin to heat the metal with fire. The rat panics. It starts clawing, digging, trying to escape. The only way out is through you. This was a real torture method used during medieval times in Europe, and also reported in ancient China and South America. It wasn't about getting answers. It was about creating a pain so terrifying no one would dare cross the king again. But it gets worse. Let's talk about the brazen bull. Ancient Greece's twisted invention. It looked like a giant bronze statue of a bull, hollow inside. Here's what they'd do. Open a door in the bull's belly, shove the condemned inside, and lock it. Then they'd light a fire underneath. As the person inside burned alive, their screams would echo through pipes designed to make them sound like a bull, roaring in agony. The crowd would cheer. It was both execution and performance art. They even invited royalty to watch. And what about scaphism? One of the most brutal deaths ever recorded, used by the Persians. They'd force-feed you milk and honey until you got severe diarrhea. Then they'd strip you naked, trap you between two boats or canoes, and cover your entire body, especially your face, in more honey. Then they'd float you on a swampy lake and, wait, days would pass. Insects would come, first the flies, then the maggots, then the rot. Your body would slowly be eaten alive while you're still breathing, delirious, bloated, begging for death. Historians say it could last up to 17 days. That's not punishment. That's psychological warfare designed to haunt everyone who witnessed it. And then we have flaying, the act of skinning someone alive. The Assyrians were known for this. They'd capture enemies, especially rebels, and peel their skin off in strips, starting from the feet and working their way up. Sometimes they'd hang the skins on city walls like trophies. A message to all. This is what happens when you challenge the empire. These weren't rare events. They were public, ritualized, sometimes even announced in advance. Why? Because fear was more powerful than laws. Fear stayed in your blood. Now let's talk about punishment. When religion got involved. During the height of the witch-hunting era in Europe, being called a witch was basically a death sentence. And it didn't take much. A weird dream, a grudge from a neighbor, even owning a cat, and suddenly, people wanted you gone. The worst part? The tests they used to prove witchcraft were designed so you'd fail no matter what. One of the most infamous was the dunking test. They'd tie you up and throw you into a freezing river. If you floated, that meant you were in league with the devil. Guilty. If you sank and drowned, well, oops, guess you were innocent. Either way, you weren't making it out alive. Another was the pricking test. Witch hunters believed witches had a devil's mark on their skin, a spot that didn't bleed or feel pain. So they'd stab you all over with needles, knives, or special pricking tools until they found one. And then came the burning. Burning someone at the stake wasn't just a quick execution. It was a show, a message. Crowds would gather, priests would chant, and the fire would be lit slowly, sometimes with wet wood so it would burn longer. Some towns even sold food during the burnings. And if you think that's the worst of it, there's more. Let's go back to ancient Rome for a minute. There was a punishment called poena culi, Latin for punishment of the sack. It was reserved for one crime, parricide or killing your own father. They'd sew you into a leather sack along with a monkey, a dog, a snake, and sometimes a rooster. All angry, all trapped with you. Then they'd toss the sack into a river. You drowned, they panicked. It was chaotic, primal, and horrifying. That's the kind of justice that makes your skin crawl. In medieval Germany, they had a punishment called the pear of anguish. It's a metal device shaped like a fruit, but it opened like a flower. They'd insert it into your mouth, or worse, other places. Then they'd turn the screw, and it would slowly expand, tearing tissue from the inside. They used it for liars, blasphemers, or just people they didn't like. But the most twisted part of all these punishments, they were invented by humans, not monsters. Ordinary people built these, crafted them, improved them, used them over and over again in the name of justice, of order, of fear. Now let's head east to ancient China. They didn't just punish the body, they punished the soul. One of the most infamous executions was called lynching, known as death by 1,000 cuts. But it wasn't poetic. It was a slow, methodical ritual of agony. First, the victim was tied up. Then the executioner would begin slicing. Bits of flesh from the chest, the arms, the legs. One small piece at a time. It could take hours. Sometimes the final blow, a stab to the heart, was only delivered at the very end if they were merciful. But here's the truly twisted part. Lynching wasn't just about pain, it was about dishonor. In Chinese belief, your body had to stay whole for the afterlife. So this wasn't just torture, it was erasure. And this wasn't done in secret. Crowds would gather. The condemned would often be drugged, not to numb the pain, but to prolong it, to keep them conscious through every cut. If you think that's the worst, wait until you hear about bamboo torture. A punishment that sounds fake, but had real consequences. It's said that in some Asian regions, prisoners were tied down above fast-growing bamboo shoots. Bamboo is strong, and it grows fast. Some varieties can grow over an inch every hour. So over days, the shoots would grow into the body, through flesh, through organs, until they emerged bloody and brutal on the other side. It's one of those punishments historians still debate. Was it real? Or a legend passed down because it was just too haunting to forget? But the fear it spread was real. Even in Japan, there were punishments that sound almost surgical in their cruelty. For certain crimes, especially betrayal or treason, there was boiling punishment. The condemned would be lowered slowly into a pot of boiling water or oil. It wasn't just a sentence, it was theater, a lesson. Sometimes instead of execution, they'd go for tattooing, but not the kind we think of today. Criminals would be forcibly tattooed on their faces, permanently marked for life. Imagine living in a society where your crime was carved into your skin. No hiding, no second chances, just shame, forever. And then there was slow hanging, a method where the noose wasn't meant to snap the neck. Instead, you'd dangle and suffocate inch by inch for several minutes, all while the public watched in silence. These weren't acts of random violence, they were carefully chosen, meant to send a message: disobeyed and this could be you. What's crazy is that in some places, these weren't even the worst-case scenarios. There were crimes where your whole family could be punished too. Parents, siblings, children. That's how far justice could go. And still, we're not done. Now let's go to the heart of the ancient Middle East, Babylon, Persia, and beyond, where justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about balance. If you broke someone's bone, they broke yours. If you destroyed a man's house and you built him a new one, or paid the price. If a builder's house collapsed and killed someone, the builder's own son could be executed. Sounds harsh, right? That's because it was meant to scare you straight. But Babylon wasn't even the darkest. The ancient Persians had a punishment so disturbing, it barely sounds real. It was called scaphism. The condemned was stripped naked and tied between two wooden canoes or hollowed logs, one above, one below, like a human sandwich. Only the arms, legs, and head stuck out. Then they were force-fed milk and honey until they couldn't hold it in anymore. Diarrhea followed. Insects came next. They'd smear honey on the exposed skin, especially on the eyes, mouth, and genitals, to attract flies, wasps, and worse. So over days, sometimes weeks, the victim would literally rot alive, eaten from the inside and out, all while still breathing. It was slow, public, and unforgettable. In Islamic empires during the medieval period, punishments were a mix of religious law and harsh deterrence. For example, theft wasn't just a slap on the wrist. In some places, repeated stealing led to amputation, usually a hand. Publicly, not always instantly, sometimes over time, depending on the region and ruler. And adultery. That could mean stoning, a group execution where the community threw rocks until death, meant to shame as well as kill. But it's important to note, not all these laws were applied equally or often. Some leaders were far more lenient. Others took it to extremes. In Assyria, one of the oldest Mesopotamian empires, there was a law where a woman caught cheating could be impaled. But here's the twist. If her husband allowed it, she could live. Control. That was the real punishment. The power to decide who lived or died. Even blasphemy wasn't taken lightly. Speaking against a god or defiling a temple could result in tongue removal, branding, or being thrown into the river, tied up, to let the gods decide your fate. Some cities had pits where you'd be buried alive, just your head sticking out, left for exposure, dehydration, or animals. Justice wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. Offend society, and you offended the gods themselves. And yet, these systems were seen as organized, as progress. Compared to chaos and mob violence, a public code, even a cruel one, was something people could understand. Still, imagine living under a system where a single mistake could cost your limbs, your family, or your life. But we're still not done. Because while ancient laws were terrifying, some ritual punishments from tribal and indigenous societies took pain and symbolism to a whole different level. Now imagine a world where punishment isn't just about breaking the law. It's about cleansing the soul, or proving your worth to the spirits. That's where we are now, deep inside the most remote and ancient societies on Earth, cultures where pain had purpose, and punishment wasn't always what you'd expect. Let's start with the Native American Mandan tribe. They held an initiation ceremony known as the Okipa. It wasn't technically punishment, but if you failed it, you were shamed forever. Young men were hooked through the chest with wooden skewers and lifted into the air by ropes. They'd hang there, suspended by their flesh, while others danced and chanted below. Some fainted, some screamed, some passed the test in total silence. Because silence was the real proof of strength. In Papua New Guinea, certain tribes practiced facial scarification not as punishment, but as a rite of passage. But if a young man showed fear or resisted the process, he could be ostracized for life. His punishment? Living as an outsider, unworthy of marriage, status, or respect. In some parts of Polynesia and ancient Australia, banishment was worse than death. Being cast out meant spiritual disconnection. You no longer had ancestors, land, or identity. You were a walking ghost. And if that wasn't enough, let's go to Africa, where some ancient tribal justice systems relied on ordeals to determine guilt. You might be forced to drink poison or stick your hand in boiling oil. If you survived, innocent. If you didn't, well, the gods had spoken. In the Congo, some communities used the poison bean test. If you vomited quickly after eating the bean, you were innocent. If you died, guilty. Insane, right? But it wasn't always deadly. In other cultures, punishment could be shaming rituals. Imagine standing in the village center, naked, painted red, with animal bones tied to your back, while children threw ashes at you. That was real, that was justice. Sometimes a person had to wear a mask, representing the spirit they offended, and act out a play of repentance in front of the whole community. Laughter was punishment. Mockery was the whip. Now here's where it gets weirder. In some Amazonian tribes, punishment wasn't about pain, and it was about dreams. Our shaman would drink a hallucinogenic brew and enter a trance to ask the spirits what the punishment should be. That punishment could be anything, from fasting to isolation to cutting ties with your family. You weren't just paying for your crime, you were spiritually reset. But even in the darkest corners of tribal justice, there was one common thread. Belief. Everyone believed the punishment mattered, that the ritual had power, that suffering meant healing, and that pain, when done right, made the community stronger. And now, we might look back and say, that's too far, that's barbaric, that's extreme. But centuries ago, these people weren't just trying to hurt someone. They were trying to preserve order in a world filled with chaos, spirits, gods, and things they didn't understand. That's what punishment meant, and whether it was hooks in your chest, poison in your mouth, or shame on your name, you never made the same mistake twice. All right. We've already gone through some of the most stomach-churning punishments from ancient Rome, Persia, China, and beyond. But the ancient world was a vast place, and humans have an endless imagination when it comes to inventing ways to punish, terrify, and control. So let's keep diving into this dark corner of history with more punishments that sound like they were ripped from a nightmare or a twisted screenwriter's imagination, but were very real. From forgotten tribes to sprawling empires, these methods were designed to break bodies, crush spirits, and send a message that no one would dare forget. The Mayan ball game of doom. Let's start with the ancient Maya, deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica. If you've heard of their famous ball game, Talk, you might picture it as a fun, athletic competition. Think again. This wasn't just a game, it could be a death sentence. The Maya played Talk on massive stone courts, using a heavy, rubber ball that players had to keep in the air without using their hands or feet. Just hips, elbows and knees. The goal? Get the ball through a tiny stone hoop high on the court's wall. Sounds tough, right? It was. But for some players, losing didn't just mean embarrassment. It meant sacrifice. In certain games, especially those tied to religious or political events, the stakes were cosmic. The losers, or sometimes even the winners, depending on the ritual, were taken straight from the court to the altar. Their priests would rip out their hearts while they were still beating, offering them to the gods. The Maya believed these sacrifices kept the sun rising and the world turning. So if you were chosen to play in one of these sacred games, you weren't just competing for glory. You were playing for your life, or your death was the ultimate honor. Imagine the crowd roaring as you slam the ball with your hip, sweat pouring, knowing that one missed shot could mean your heart is next on the altar. The ball game wasn't just sport. It was punishment, ritual, and spectacle all rolled into one. The Aztec Flower Wars, death by divine selection. Sticking with Mesoamerica, let's talk about the Aztecs and their infamous Flower Wars. These weren't battles for land or power, they were staged fights to capture prisoners for sacrifice. The Aztecs believed their gods, especially the sun god Huitzilopochtli, demanded human blood to keep the universe in balance. So they'd arranged these ritual wars with neighboring city-states, almost like scheduling a deadly playdate. Warriors would fight not to kill but to capture. If you were taken alive, you weren't just a prisoner, you were a future offering. The punishment? Being marched up the steps of a towering pyramid where priests would cut open your chest with an obsidian blade and pull out your still-beating heart. Your body might then be rolled down the pyramid steps, a bloody spectacle for the crowd below. But here's where it gets even wilder. Some captives faced a punishment called gladiatorial sacrifice. They'd be tied to a stone platform, given a weak wooden weapon, and forced to fight elite Aztec warriors. It was less a fight and more a ritual slaughter, designed to humiliate and display the power of the Aztec gods. If you survived longer than expected, that just meant more glory for the gods when you finally fell. The Flower Wars weren't about justice in the way we think of it. They were about feeding the divine order, making sure the gods stayed happy, even if it meant your heart was the price. The Celtic Wicker Man, a fiery end. Now let's head to ancient Europe, where the Celts had a punishment so cinematic it inspired horror movies. Ever heard of the Wicker Man? This wasn't just a creepy Nicolas Cage film. It was a real ritual described by none other than Julius Caesar himself. The Celts, particularly the Druids, would build massive effigies out of wood and wicker, shaped like humans or animals. These towering structures could be 20 or 30 feet tall. Then, for major religious festivals or to punish serious offenders, Like traitors or enemies of the tribe, they'd fill the wicker structure with people, animals, or both. The final step? Set the whole thing on fire. Imagine being trapped inside a giant wooden statue, surrounded by screaming animals and other prisoners, as the flames creep closer. The smoke, the heat, the chaos. It was a death designed to terrify and appease the gods in one brutal swoop. Caesar wrote that the Druids believed these sacrifices ensured prosperity and divine favor. Whether it was criminals, captives, or even volunteers in some cases, the Wicker Man was a fiery reminder: don't cross the gods or the tribe. Historians still debate how common this was, but the accounts are chilling. The Celts didn't just want death, they wanted a spectacle that would echo through the ages. The Siberian exile of the soul. Now let's travel to the icy expanses of ancient Siberia, where nomadic tribes had their own brutal take on punishment. For crimes like treason or defying the shaman's authority, some tribes didn't just kill you, they exiled your body and soul. One punishment involved stripping the offender naked and tying them to a tree in the middle of the taiga, the vast Siberian forest. They'd leave you there, exposed to the elements, freezing winters, biting insects, or prowling wolves. Death could come from hypothermia, starvation, or predators, but the real cruelty was the isolation. In many Siberian cultures, the soul's journey after death was tied to community rituals. By leaving you alone in the wilderness, they weren't just killing your body, they were cutting your soul off from the afterlife, dooming you to wander forever. Some tribes took it further. They'd carve symbols into the victim's skin before abandoning them, marking them as cursed in the eyes of the spirits. Even if you somehow survived, you'd be an outcast, shunned by every village. It was a punishment that didn't just end your life, it erased your existence. The Japanese tsum, claw of shame. Let's shift to feudal Japan, where honor was everything, and punishments were often about stripping it away. One lesser-known method was called tsume, or claw punishment. This was reserved for samurai or nobles who committed minor crimes, like disrespecting a superior or failing in their duties, but weren't severe enough for execution. Here's how it worked. The offender's fingernails would be forcibly removed one by one, using sharp tools or hot irons. Then they'd be forced to continue their duties, writing, wielding a sword, or performing rituals with bleeding, mangled fingers. The pain was excruciating, but the real punishment was the shame. In a society obsessed with perfection and grace, having disfigured hands was a public mark of failure. You couldn't hide it. Every task became a reminder of your disgrace. For women, particularly those in the imperial court, a similar punishment involved cutting off their hair, a symbol of beauty and status, and sometimes branding their scalp with a small mark. These punishments didn't kill you, but they made sure you carried your crime with you, visible to everyone for the rest of your life. The Incan Cliff of No Return. High in the Andes, the Inca Empire had a punishment that used the landscape itself as a weapon. For crimes like rebellion or defying the Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, offenders faced the Cliff of No Return. This wasn't just a poetic name. The Inca would take the condemned to a sacred cliff, often thousands of feet above a rocky valley, and push them off. But it wasn't always a quick drop. In some cases, the victim was tied up and lowered slowly, dangling over the edge, forced to stare into the abyss below. The psychological torment was as brutal as the fall. The Inca believed the mountains were sacred, home to the gods. So this punishment wasn't just execution, it was a rejection by the divine. Your death was a message. You were unworthy of the empire, unworthy of the gods. Sometimes, to add insult to injury, the body wouldn't be retrieved. It would be left for scavengers, ensuring no proper burial, a final disgrace in a culture that revered ancestor worship. The Polynesian shark feast. Across the vast Pacific, ancient Polynesian societies had their own unique punishments, often tied to the ocean that defined their world. One particularly chilling method was reserved for those who broke sacred taboos, or kapu, like stealing from a chief or disrespecting a temple. The offender would be taken far out to sea, tied to a canoe, and cut just enough to draw blood. Then they'd be left adrift in waters known for sharks. The blood would attract predators, and the victim would be eaten alive, their screams echoing across the waves. This wasn't just about death, it was about erasing the offender from the community. By feeding them to the sea, the Polynesians believed they were giving the crime back to the gods, letting the ocean itself judge the guilty. The fear of this punishment was so strong that even the hint of breaking a kapu could keep entire villages in line. The ocean was both life and death, and the Polynesians knew how to make it a terrifying enforcer. The African ordeal of the poisoned root. In some ancient African societies, particularly among the Ashanti and other West African tribes, justice often involved the gods directly. One punishment, or rather a trial, was the ordeal of the poisoned root. If you were accused of a serious crime, like witchcraft or murder, you might be forced to drink a concoction made from a toxic plant, like the sasswood tree. Here's the deal. If you survived the poison, the gods had declared you innocent. If you died, well, that was proof of your guilt. The catch: the dose was often calibrated to be just strong enough to kill most people. Vomiting or passing out wasn't enough. You had to stay conscious and walk away to prove your innocence. The whole village would watch, chanting or praying as you staggered under the poison's effects. It was a public spectacle, blending justice with divine judgment. This wasn't just about the individual. It was about restoring balance to the community, ensuring the gods were satisfied. But for the accused, it was a gamble with death itself. The Norse holmgang trial by combat. Back in Viking Scandinavia, we've already covered the blood eagle, but they had another punishment that sounds like it belongs in a fantasy novel, the holmgang. This was a ritual duel, a trial by combat, used to settle disputes, everything from land disagreements to accusations of theft or betrayal. The rules were simple but brutal. Two fighters would meet on a small island or a marked-off space, armed with swords or axes. They'd fight until one was dead or too injured to continue. The winner was deemed innocent, favored by the gods. The loser, well, they were either dead or disgraced, often banished if they survived. What makes holmgang so wild is that it wasn't always fair. A strong warrior could challenge a weaker opponent, knowing they'd likely win. It was less about justice and more about power, and the spectacle of blood. The Vikings loved a good show, and holmgang was as much theatre as it was punishment. The Indian elephant crush. In ancient India, particularly under certain Mughal and South Indian rulers, there was a punishment that combined sheer power with public terror: execution by elephant. Elephants were revered as symbols of strength and royalty, but they were also trained for war and for punishment. If you were convicted of a major crime like treason or rebellion, You might be tied to the ground or a post. Then a trained war elephant would be brought in. Sometimes it would simply step on your head, crushing it instantly. Other times, the elephant would be directed to trample your entire body, breaking every bone. In the most gruesome cases, the elephant would use its trunk to tear limbs or impale the victim with its tusks. This wasn't just about death. It was about showing the might of the ruler, who could command even nature's strongest beasts. Crowds would gather, awestruck and terrified, as the elephant carried out the sentence. It was a punishment that said, "No one, not even the strongest rebel, can stand against the king." The Mongolian boiling cauldron. In the vast steppes of ancient Mongolia, the Mongols were known for their conquests, but their punishments were just as fearsome. One method, reserved for traitors or captured enemy leaders, was death by boiling. The victim would be stripped and thrown into a massive iron cauldron filled with water, oil, or even tar. A fire would be lit beneath, slowly heating the liquid until it boiled. The process was agonizingly slow. The victim would scream as their skin blistered and peeled, often staying alive for far longer than you'd expect. The Mongols didn't do this in secret. Crowds would watch, and the execution was often paired with other displays of power, like parading the victim's head afterward. This punishment wasn't just about killing. It was about erasing the enemy's legacy, showing that even the mightiest warrior could be reduced to nothing under Mongol rule. The Aboriginal fire stick punishment. In ancient Australia, Aboriginal tribes had their own systems of justice, often tied to the land and community survival. One punishment for serious crimes, like breaking sacred laws or endangering the group, was the fire stick ordeal. The offender would be forced to hold or carry a burning fire stick, often coated with resin, to make it burn hotter and longer. They'd have to walk a set distance, sometimes through the community, while the fire seared their hands. Dropping the stick was a sign of guilt or weakness, and the punishment could escalate banishment or even death by spearing. The fire stick wasn't just about pain. It was symbolic. Fire was life in the harsh Australian outback, used for hunting, cooking, and warmth. By turning it into a tool of punishment, the tribe showed that even the most sacred elements could judge you. The Byzantine blinding ritual. In the Byzantine Empire, where power struggles were constant, execution wasn't always the go-to punishment for political rivals. Instead, they had a method that was both cruel and strategic: blinding. If you were a deposed emperor, a rebellious general, or a scheming noble, you might be sentenced to have your eyes gouged out or burned with hot irons. This wasn't just about pain, it was about disqualification. A blind man couldn't rule, couldn't lead an army, couldn't threaten the throne. But you were left alive, a walking reminder of your failure. The Byzantines would often parade the blinded victim through the streets of Constantinople, letting the public see what happened to those who challenged the emperor. Some accounts describe victims begging for death instead, but the Byzantines saw this as mercy, letting you live, but never letting you forget. The Inuit ice exile. In the Arctic, where survival was a daily battle, the Inuit had punishments that used the environment itself. For crimes like theft or endangering the group, you might face ice exile. The offender would be taken far from the community and left on an ice floe with no food, no tools, and no way back. The Arctic was unforgiving. Freezing temperatures, polar bears, or simply starvation would claim you. But like the Siberian exile, this wasn't just about death. It was about cutting you off from the community. the only thing that ensured survival in such a harsh world. The Inuit relied on cooperation, so being cast out was the ultimate punishment, both physical and social. Get the Persian ash pile. Back in ancient Persia, we've already covered scaphism, but they had another punishment that was less elaborate, but just as grim: the ash pile. For certain crimes, like defying the king or religious blasphemy, the victim would be buried up to their neck in a pile of hot ashes. The ashes would burn and suffocate, causing a slow, agonizing death as the heat seared their lungs and skin. This was often done in public squares, with the ashes left as a warning for days afterward. It was cheap, effective, and terrifying, a reminder that even something as simple as ash could become a tool of royal vengeance. The Germanic breaking wheel. In medieval Germanic lands, one of the most gruesome punishments was the breaking wheel. Reserved for heinous crimes like murder or highway robbery, this was a public spectacle designed to shock. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use a heavy iron bar to smash their limbs, breaking every major bone. The wheel was then hoisted upright, and the victim was left to die, sometimes over days, from shock, blood loss, or exposure. In some cases, the executioner would deliver a mercy blow to the chest or neck, but only if the crowd or the judge allowed it. The wheel was often displayed in town squares, a rotting reminder of what happened to those who broke the law. The Tlingit shame pole. Among the Tlingit people of the Pacific Northwest, punishment wasn't always about physical pain. It was about social destruction. For crimes like theft or breaking tribal laws, you might face the shame pole. This was a carved totem pole, erected in the village, depicting your crime in humiliating detail. Your face, your act, your disgrace, all carved for everyone to see. The pole wasn't just a one-time embarrassment. It stood for years, sometimes generations, ensuring your shame lived on long after you were gone. In a culture where honor and reputation were everything, this was a fate worse than death for many. Why these punishments? What ties all these punishments together? Whether it's the Mayan bull game, the Persian ash pile, or the Tlingit shame pole, is their purpose. They weren't just about stopping crime. They were about control, fear, and power. Ancient societies didn't have prisons or rehabilitation systems like we do today. Punishment had to be immediate, visible, and unforgettable. It had to make you think twice, no, 100 times, before crossing the line. These punishments were also deeply tied to the beliefs of their time. The Maya and Aztecs saw death as a gift to the gods. The Celts and Vikings believed in divine judgment through fire or combat. The Chinese and Japanese saw the body and soul as intertwined, so punishments often targeted both. Even the shame-based punishments, like India's donkey parade or the Tlingit shame pole, were about stripping away your place in society, leaving you with nothing. And here's the chilling truth. These weren't the work of monsters. They were designed by humans, people like you and me, who believed this was the only way to keep order, to protect their world, to send a message. Some of these punishments lasted centuries, refined and ritualized because they worked. They kept people in line through sheer terror. Final thoughts. So the next time you hear about a punishment that sounds too wild to be true, like being sewn into a sack with a snake or boiled alive in a bronze bull, remember this: humans have always been creative, especially when it comes to fear. These ancient punishments weren't just about justice, They were about power, spectacle, and making sure no one forgot the cost of stepping out of line. What's the craziest punishment you've heard of? Drop it in the comments and let's keep this dark journey through history going. If you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We've got plenty more where this came from.